look for.
We're having a discussion earlier about the Federal Reserve and whether or not there is, in fact, inflation out there. And you don't think people are actually, you think they're underestimating inflation?
Well, what I think is that right now inflation expectations are very low because right now inflation is very low and there's no imminent sign that that's going to change. But here's the issue. Whenever you have a strategy, you have to be worried about what could fail. And right now, to the extent that people have very little inflation protection in their portfolios, that is, I think, a risk because, in fact, the one thing that could be bad for both stocks and bonds simultaneously is if there's an inflation surprise. And here's the sort of interesting wrinkle. Given that expectations for inflation are so low, it wouldn't take much for there to be an inflation surprise, which is why we think it's a very important thing for our clients to have some exposure to real assets and also inflation-protected bonds.
So you're talking oil, you're talking gold, commodities?
Well, some exposure to commodity futures, some exposure to natural resource stocks that produce commodities, and some exposure to those parts of the real estate market that are more inflation sensitive.
Michael, what about that? What kind of an allocation do you want to have from your standpoint, equities versus other things like commodities, real estate, alternatives?
Well, this dialogue is right up our alley in permanent portfolio. So, I mean, yeah, our views on inflation would be that right now it's not a risk. There's slack in labor, there's slack in capital, the velocity on money is very low, and activity levels are low. But that shouldn't be confused with a long-term inflation surprise or risk. So I'm on board with those comments. We would advocate a strategy very similar to what's described. Investments in U.S. and non-U.S. equities, bonds, also commodities, real estate stocks, precious metals, and non-dollar assets such as Swiss francs or Swiss government bonds.